Minutes went by. He could feel the presence of the man right beside right beside him, just away from the leaves. He didn't dare make a move or a sound of any kind. And then there was a little brush of a leaf moving a little further away, and then the slightest sound of a foot brushing a tiny stick about 15 feet away. And he realized the man was moving on. The medallion was still hot, and it took about 15 more minutes for it to start to cool. And over the course of the next hour, it cooled completely. He still didn't move because it was still pitch black, and waited, and the medallion stayed cool through the hours until it started to uh, get to be gray as day was coming, as the jungle started to get to be gray. And then, with the greatest care, he slid the leaves off him, got to his feet, and like a shadow, moved to the path along the river. It was light enough to see the path, and he started running. Now, we're not talking we're not talking a jog that eats up the miles. We're talking a flat out run. He ran and kept running, and got to be an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and mid morning, the medallion started to heat up, and he knew they were coming. And he kept running for another maybe 30, 35 minutes, and the medallion got hotter and hotter. He took a quick look back at one point and saw figures moving along the river quite a ways back. But they could run just like he could run. And the medallion got hotter and hotter. He knew they were getting close. So he knew he had to make a stand. And as he ran, and we're talking, full run, he kept looking for a place that he could make a stand. And he came to a clearing in the jungle to his left. And it was, the size of maybe the size of a soccer field. And it looked like it had once been cleared for farming, but had been let go. And there were some bushes in it and grass starting to grow up, but the grass was only maybe knee high, a little bit higher than knee high. So he ran out into the field, grabbed his armor shirt, put it on out of his sack, grabbed his armor shirt, loaded the sling, and stood facing the forest, uh, uh, back at the trail where the trail was. And it was just the forest. It was a wall of green bushes between him and the trail, and he was maybe 20 yards out in the field, and he had the sling going. The medallion was burning hot, and he stood there and waited. All of a sudden, 6 arrows materialized out of the greenery and struck him in the chest and stomach, in the armor shirt. The force of the arrows was so great it staggered him. But the arrows hit the armor shirt, and each one of them fell to the ground, but they left a black mark on the armor shirt. And when he staggered and then got his feet under him and stood up, and by the time he got his feet planted and got the sling going again, there were 6 men standing at him, standing in front of him 20 yards away at the edge of the greenery. They had long bows, long bows and arrows, and each arrow fitted to their bow had a black uh, tip. Their faces were painted completely black and their teeth were filed to points. And they stood looking at him. Adzul decided he had to go on the offensive. So he had the sling going. He started with a fierce look. He got the fiercest look on his face he could, and he started toward them, advancing across the field. When he got to be 10 yards away, he noticed that they were talking to themselves and they were startled. And the reason they were startled and confused is because the arrows had curare on the tip. And curare, he should have been down in his death throes on the ground from those arrows. Monkeys, they'd shoot a monkey high up in the tree, and the monkey in a minute or less would be falling down. The curare is a deadly poison that they made. But he was very much alive, and he had a fierce look on his face, and he was advancing on him. As he looked at them, he noticed they were kind of talking to a little bit taller guy in the middle. And Adzul guessed that was the leader, and he released a rock without breaking stride. He released a rock, and the leader grunted. The rock shattered his left arm, broke his arm just above the elbow, between the shoulder and the elbow, grunted and dropped his bow. And they all looked really startled. And he realized that the rock had come so fast, he'd released it so fast, that they didn't know what had happened. And without missing a beat, he slipped the sling behind him so they wouldn't see it was just an ordinary weapon. And then he stopped. And in a loud voice in the Inca language, he started yelling at them. But his hands were moving in universal sign language. And what he told them was that he had meant them no harm. They had no business following him and chasing him. He wanted them to leave, or he would inflict damage again. And they're all staring at him, and he's alive. He should have been dead in their minds. And all of a sudden, all 6 of them fell to their knees, stretched their hands out on the ground in front of them, and backed off on their knees into the greenery. And Adzul was so startled he didn't know what to do, but here they came back again, still on their knees, pushing in front of them large woven sort of basket packs, and some fruit spilled out of one of them as they pushed it across the ground. And he realized this was the provisions that they carried when they were chasing him, and they were making an offering to him. And he told them again in sign language, yelling, he never wanted to see them again. And they all backed out of sight into the greenery on their knees, heads down, and disappeared. within minutes, the medallion started to cool. And in about 15 minutes, it was totally cool. And he knew they'd gone. So he collected what he could use from the food. There was some meat and there was some fruit and some stuff. He collected what he could use, put it in his pack, and then threw their baskets into the forest, and they had left their weapons, and took their weapons, their bows and arrows, and broke them and buried them in the ground where they would deteriorate quickly. And then he walked out to the trail and started in a trot, an easy jog up the trail. Before long, the medallion stayed really, really cool. It was bloody hot in the forest, in the jungle. Before long, he stopped, took off his armor shirt, put it in his pack, and went on, bare-chested and bare-legged. He just had a loincloth on. And the medallion never warmed up. These men were gone for good. So he proceeded, and he stayed in a northerly direction for the next few weeks. And one day, he could, on the left, whenever there was a break in the jungle, he could see the mountains to the left, which were, in our knowledge, the Andes, starting to get a little bit smaller, lower. He was getting to the end of the mountain range. And as he kept going, he came on the trader's path. And he knew it was a trader's path because every so often there were stone cairns, piles of stones to mark the trail. And once he got to the trader's path, he made really good time going north. Didn't see anybody. Didn't see any evidence of people living in the jungle or people off the trader's path. And went on for 2-3 weeks. And mid-afternoon, one day, he came on an area to the left of the trader's path, which was, I don't know, the size of maybe 10 soccer fields altogether. And there wasn't much, it had been clear. Now it was coming, there was grass and bushes growing back on it, but the big thing was that in the middle of this cleared area was an enormous pyramid, a 4-sided pyramid with a flat top. And he stayed in the protection of the trees and just studied it. There was nothing moving around the pyramid. And he was pretty sure it had been abandoned because bushes and grasses were beginning to grow on the sides of the pyramid. And in front of him were stairs, on the pyramid were stairs going all the way to the top. He looked to the right and he could see stairs going to the top on the right side as well. The way it was positioned, he couldn't see to the left, but the stairs in front of him went all the way to the flat top. But at the bottom of the pyramid, the stairs he was looking at were separated by a doorway, an opening in the base of the pyramid. And the opening was about 8 feet high and about 12 to 15 feet wide. It was a big opening. And he knew that in Inca pyramids, there were openings at the base of the pyramids that could go back into the interior of the base of the pyramid. And in Inca pyramids, there was often food back there for the priests who did the rituals for the pyramid. And he wondered if there might be some old food left over in this pyramid, inside the pyramid, because he was, he'd been living on monkey meat for a long time and he was getting kind of tired of monkey meat. So the first thing he did was, staying in the trees, he moved carefully to the right on and around the pyramid, very, very carefully. And there was nothing, there was no doorway on the right-hand side, but there were stairs all the way up. On the back side, opposite from where he had approached, stairs all the way up, but no doorway. And on the left side, as he came around, stairs all the way up, but no doorway. And no sign of life. So he got back to his original spot. He put his pack down, and the medallion was cool, but he put on his armor shirt just in case, going into an unknown situation. He put on his armor shirt, and he loaded his sling. And after again making sure that nothing was around, no human was around anyway, birds and butterflies and all of the insects were around, he shortened the sling to about 3 feet, which he thought he could operate pretty well inside that doorway. And if the pyramid was anything like Inca pyramids, that door opened into a hallway, or a tunnel kind of, that went to the middle of the pyramid. And he figured he could operate the sling effectively in that tunnel. And he carefully approached the doorway. There were no doors. It was just an opening. And he could see that there was dirt on the floor inside, but when he got inside and let his eyes adjust, he rubbed his monkey skin sandal on the dirt, and there was smooth stones under it. So he knew that it had been abandoned for some time. For dirt to have blown in there and the stones not to be clear, people had left it some time before, some pretty long time before. So he walked carefully down this long tunnel or hallway, and at the end he could see a similar opening to what he had walked through from the outside, about 15 feet across and about 8 feet high. And he knew that there should be a big room beyond that, under the base, in the base, under the pyramid. So he got to the doorway and looked into an enormous room, which was under the pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid. And there were big columns placed around the room that were holding the pyramid above the opening of the room, supporting the pyramid above it. But sections of the roof of the room had fallen away. Rocks and rubble had fallen away, so there were piles of rubble around the inside, on the floor of this big room, around the inside. Well, he also saw light. I mean, there was faint light, and he saw that there were shafts, open shafts, extending to the sides through the walls of the pyramid that let light come in from the outside. So it wasn't pitch black. It was somewhat lit. And his eyes went around the room pretty quickly, and he saw no doorways, no side doorways, which would have opened into storerooms and where he had hoped he might find food. there were no side doorways. So he knew he was out of luck, no food. And he was just starting to turn back to the hallway when movement caught the corner of his left eye across the room. And he swung his head and stared, and everything was still. And he started to turn again to go down the hall when there was movement, and he turned his head quickly enough to catch a figure in the dim light cross from one pile of rubble to behind another pile of rubble closer to him, and the medallion started to get hot. So he knew there was danger. And he immediately left the room and backed down the hall, keeping his eyes on the doorway into the room, and had the sling swinging 3 feet, a 3 feet circle, but nothing appeared. And he backed all the way down the hall and backed out into the sunlight, and his eyes, the bright sun, his eyes had to adjust to the sun, and just as his eyes were adjusting to the sun, he thought he saw something move in the doorway at the far end of the hall, and the medallion was hot. He lengthened the sling to its full 5 feet length and got it going around his head and kept backing up. 20 yards away from the entrance, with no warning but an enormous roar, a figure charged out of the hall at him. And it came so fast, and the roar was so loud, he never had a chance to release the rock. And as it came at him, he recognized a orange and black skin, and the word came into his mind, jaguar. He'd never seen one, but his father had told him about these animals. And in the space of a second, his mind identified the roar as that roar he'd occasionally heard sleeping in the jungle. And then it hit him. And all this happened so fast, he never had a chance to release the rock. The jaguar hit him, 200 pounds of fury hit him smack in the chest. Its claws on its front legs locked into the armor shirt, and he was knocked backward on his back, and the face with huge teeth lunged at his face, and only by getting his hands up both around the animal's neck was he able to hold that snarling face away from him. Well, what saved his life was the claws of the jaguar locked in the material of the armor shirt, and the jaguar could not get him out. Otherwise, Adzul would have been dead in 30 seconds. But the claws were locked in the armor shirt. The jaguar couldn't get him out. And Adzul was strong enough for the moment to hold its face away from him, even though it was pressing him. He was down on his back and he had to move his head back. But the jaguar's back legs started clawing at him. and they hit his thighs and knees and legs, and their claws were extremely sharp, and they opened wounds all the way to the bone in his legs, and blood started pouring out, and his strength started to go, and he was holding the face away and holding the face away, and he knew, but his arms were starting to weaken. The pressure was incredible. The animal's very strong. The pressure was incredible, and he gave one titanic effort to sit up and throw the jaguar to the side. And he got up, sort of partially sitting, holding it, and its face was getting closer and closer. His arms were shaking and starting to weaken. And he was in that position, and he felt his strength starting to go. And all of a sudden, the jaguar lurched to one side. That is, its body jerked to one side, and then it straightened and was still on him, but it didn't seem quite as strong. And then it lurched to the side again, and its eyes went dim. And Adzul pushed it off his body to the left, and as he did, he noticed two spears in the animal's side. He sat there with his head on his chest, badly, badly wounded, completely exhausted. And he finally rolled to his right and got on his hands and knees, and then collapsed. And the last thing he saw as he collapsed was a girl standing beside him with a spear in her hand. Well, his next consciousness was of a roaring noise. And he'd been having a dream. And of fighting a big beast. He'd been having a dream of going underwater and drowning and trying to fight his way up through the water. He'd been having a dream of being extremely cold, one dream after another. And he fought his way to consciousness and opened his eyes, and he was in great pain, and it was dark. And this roaring kept up. And he looked at his feet, and just beyond his feet was a small fire burning, a small cooking fire burning. And by the side of the fire was a girl crouched, sort of half kneeling, but crouched down, staring across the fire to his left. He turned his head to his left, and there was another jaguar roaring. And as his head turned toward it, it leaped right at him. And that's the end of the story for today. So even if you've read the book and you know what happens, use your imagination. Try and write what happens next. If you haven't read the book, use your imagination and write what you think is going to happen next. And we'll continue with the next episode tomorrow.